and welcome to Africafé, the broadcast that brings to light African organization and issues. Today, we're going to talk about the world economic perspectives and their impact on the African continent. But before we do that, let's delve into this question.
The global economy has experienced disruption since the outbreak of COVID-19. In late 2021, soaring natural gas prices triggered a new crisis, leading to high inflation and global shortages that heavily impacted the African continent. Experts agree to identify three key elements that led to this crisis: geopolitical tensions around the conflict in Ukraine, a slow post-COVID economic recovery, and disrupted supply chains. As the African continent comprises more than 50 countries, each with different levels of development and resources, the economic crisis will not be felt to the same degree for each country. Nevertheless, some common economic implications can be highlighted, such as a decline in household purchasing power, a slowdown in production and economic growth, and rising inequality.
Hello Otaviano, it's a pleasure to have you here with us for this new episode of Africafé. Today I want to talk with you about the current world economic crisis, the economic perspectives and their impact on the African continent, and how can we build more resilience. So before we delve into the solutions and how the African continent is impacted, I would like you to give us your analysis of the current economic state of the world and how do you interpret it?
Perfect. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess we're living through the aftermath of what one might call a perfect storm. The combination of the pandemic, the plague that we had in the last 2 years, that is still significant in some parts of the world, particularly if you look at what China has been doing with its strict mandate to reduce it to zero, but also the manifestations of climate change, the heat waves everywhere, in China, India, South America, and so on. We also had war and the situation in Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine, provoked strong shocks on not only commodity price, but also with implications afterwards through the geopolitics on the availability of gas to Europe, and we are watching a concerning deceleration in global growth. The U.S., because of the additional consequence of all this, that has been a tendency towards stagflation, meaning a lower growth, most likely recession, either a light recession or a deep one, but that's the case of deceleration that we are watching in the U.S. economy. In Europe as well, I would say that the odds of a deep recession in Europe are even higher because of the fact that it is the inflation is due to shocks, but also the adjustment of Chinese economic growth to a lower pace. We will see something in between 2.5 or 3% of China because of some of the facts that I mentioned. The fact of the matter is that we have these three big poles moving down in terms of growth, while inflation in the case of Europe and the US will still remain reasonably high above the targets, which means that the monetary policy will have to remain very tight in the US. So slow down in some respects with some degree of resemblance to the 70s.
Yeah, it's true that everyone's now talking about a global recession, about a compounded crisis layered by climate change, the aftermath of COVID crisis, but also new geopolitical tensions with the war in Ukraine, but also with a rising tension and confrontational poses between China and the United States, and that obviously impacts the European Union, that is known to be one of the most integrated continent in the world, home of one of the most developed countries, and still we are talking about recession and ways for this union and those countries to be resilient and their population not to suffer too much from this crisis. So my question would be, how about the African continent? What does that mean? Does this mean that the African continent will be a victim, an exposed witness to this crisis?
In at least three points that it's important that we keep them in sight. Two of them associated with directly with the geopolitics. Of course, the commodity price shocks that I refer to as part of the perfect storm hit directly most sub-Saharan African countries.
Okay.
The food price rise, as well as in the case of the energy importers, through the higher price of oil and similar products, but also given the previous trajectory of debt in some of these countries, the combination has been terrible in terms of pushing many countries toward beyond the limits of feasibility of debt of debt. So in some case, countries should look at the alternative of pushing for some sort of a debt renegotiation. That's quite clear. And when it comes to the geopolitics, naturally, a new point also to be taken into account is the demand that is coming out there as inevitably the energy transition gets the speed for those minerals and metals, the demand for which will rise dramatically as compared to fossil fuels.
We're talking about rare earths also that are quite in demand for the energy transition, for the lithium batteries, for the electric cars, and cobalt, and those things are present in profusion in Africa. So is this energy transition a way for Africa to be more resilient to crisis, or is she going to be even more exposed to debt?
It's a double-edged sword in the following sense. On the one hand, there will be obviously the opportunity for rising production of these products. And as we know, history has shown clearly, natural resource richness may either be a blessing or a curse.
Yes.
It depends on how the country uses the natural resource richness. And obviously, the mineral in high demand will create an opportunity. On the other hand, local governance matters a lot so as to make sure that those are accrued in a way that caters to local development of the population and so on. And we have good examples. I always like to refer to Botswana, for instance, as a fantastic example on how to use well natural resource richness. At the same time, obviously, we know that the geopolitical clashes will also accentuate the dispute between powers in trying to guarantee grabbing access to these minerals. Everyone is now trying to be in DRC.
Yes, because of the cobalt.
Yes, including militias, as we know. So this is also a looming risk that has to be observed, and there should be more multilateral action in terms of guarantees of a governance structure that does not allow countries, including the region, to be prey of such a process.
Yeah, but obviously local governance, good governance, actual mechanism and public policies to reduce corruption within governments in Africa is the way forward. But to take into account your expertise, I would like to ask you, from an economical standpoint, what can the African countries do as of today to better protect themselves against this perfect storm coming?
Well, basically, make sure that you have in place the management of the public sector according to the principles of good governance that are reasonably, it's not hard to know how well to do it. The difficulty is in implementing them. But there are guiding principles of good governance, which include, obviously, transparency, establishment of a criteria to select projects to be financed, to the extent of possible, the use of rules of fiscal management to avoid discretionary sudden changes of pattern of expenditures and so on. Contracts that are sufficiently visible to everyone and so on. The roadmap is reasonably well. The hardship is in making them concrete. I guess this is the best defense that these countries can have with respect to the risks and temptations that this new environment may create to them.
Yes, indeed. You emphasized the point on local governance, but you also talked about inflation. It's a big topic, and you talked about this concept, stagflation. Thank you for explaining it to our viewers. For the African continent, there's a big need of growth. We often talk about the fact that the African continent needs 1 million jobs a day. How are the African countries gonna live? How are they gonna reach their growth objectives if we're saying that this recession is coming, it's looming, and it's here to stay?
Yeah, particularly the stagflation as a phenomenon to be, let's say, associated to the rich countries, to Europe, United States, and to a lower extent to China, keeping in mind that when we talk about low growth in China, we're talking about 3% a year and so on, which is quite different. But ultimately, since there are no miracles in those things, definitely keeping the house in order and not postponing necessary, for instance, debt adjustments is the best way to avoid sour medicines later on. I guess the issue of debt sustainability is key. See, we learned a hard lesson taken from the past is how sometimes procrastination is deadly.
Yes, deadly indeed.
You procrastinate, and then the solution to the problems get
harder and harder.
Harder and harder. So the issue of debt has to be reckoned, and that's an area where the external support is fundamental. See, the G20 came with a framework to organize the eventual reckoning of accounts that are clearly unsustainable today. But it was easy to suspend the service of existing debt for a time, but we needed the participation of all creditors, official and creditors, and also private creditors in some case, in order to have a significant, definitive resolution of the issue of debt. Otherwise, we're already watching some signals referring to outside the region. Think of what happened to Sri Lanka and so on, the hardship of Pakistan as well. And for that, we have to have everyone on board on the creditor side. Yes. China has to be as well more willing to accept debt renegotiation in terms that be reasonably comparable to the other creditors.
Yeah. Of course, we talk about this big topic about this debt trap that China tries to implement in some African countries. There's this big issue of debt for African countries, and of course, it can be in the future, and with recession coming and low growth, a big issue for the African countries. But you put a big emphasis on local governance, and there's also something quite interesting in your analysis is this timely manner, is that there's an urgency and things need to be done now. And the more we procrastinate on the essential reforms that African countries need to do, not only to resist this current recession, but also to move forward in essentially, fundamentally in their development, it's this sense of urgency and that things needs to be done now. So,
It's true.
So yeah.
Let's also let me also call attention to the potential of gains in integration. Finally, the region has taken steps in that direction. I remember at the times of my times at the World Bank, an interesting, very important report showing the degree of fragmentation of Africa. My own personal experience, I remember one of my missions, I came to Mozambique, and then the following day I had to go to Rwanda. And I had to go to Johannesburg to take another flight to Rwanda, and something happened, and that flight didn't happen. Yeah. And the piece of advice that came to me was to take a flight from Mozambique to Belgium, to then return to Africa, to Rwanda. A waste, a loss of resource. The fact is that the degree of fragmentation of Africa imposes a cost to the African economy.
So yeah, the questions are quite complex, and I wish I could continue this interview for an hour, because indeed the issues are huge and the stakes are very high for the African continent, and we need to protect ourselves from this perfect storm coming. Your solutions are quite timely and interesting, and we hope that they can be implemented urgently and in a timely manner. So thank you so much for your interventions and analysis, and I wish to see you soon in the next Africafé broadcast.
Perfect.
To know more, you can consult our website, policycenter.ma, and see you soon for a next Africafé broadcast.